Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about using and working with ES6 modules and being able to import and export values between different modules. All right, so the problem that we're trying to solve generally here, just to get started. So as we begin writing more and more complex code in JavaScript, we're going to find that we might want to be able to break up that code across multiple different files. So currently, all the work we've done so far has generally been inside of just a single file, like a single index.js. But as we try to write more and more complicated applications, we find that we may not want to do that. Right? I want to be able to have different modules, different files to be able to support different kinds of code. So while it's totally possible to, in our index.html file, be able to just include multiple scripts, right? I could say, for example, I want to include an index.js as well as an other.js. And then that'll let me both load my index.js file and my other.js file, which at the moment are very simple because we're just doing a very simple example. So I can run multiple JavaScript files, which is fine, right? When I do that, it just loads and runs both those two files. However, as we're trying to build out more complicated applications, we probably want to make sure these files are kept isolated, right? I want to make sure that the code I write in one file doesn't necessarily impact the stuff I do in the other. In particular, we want things like variables and functions to not have to exist within a global space. What we want to do is we want to make sure that each of these scripts are self-contained so that I can have things like private values or variables that I don't have to worry about things like conflicting variable names, particularly as I add more and more kinds of files. So JavaScript refers to these as modules, which really are just files. Like each file is a module in JavaScript, so we can use those terms a little bit interchangeably. But a module is a self-contained script that runs within its own namespace, which means that any variables declared inside of each module are not going to conflict with variables included inside of another module. So, for example, if I'm trying to create a person object in index.js, if my other also wants to have a person object, because I want to be able to talk about people in that script, right? And this is going to be Joel, and this is going to be Ross, and this will be an old Joel, right? So age will be old, right? This will be a different kind of person object. If I try to write this code, when I run my file, I get an error because in my other script, person object was already declared, which means I have to go back to index to understand that, and that becomes a problem. I really would like these two things to be isolated so that each can have their own data value, each can have their own person object value. We want them to be kept separate. So the way that we can do that using ES6, and this is supported by most modern browsers as of about 2019, 2020 or so, so it's moderately recently, this is sort of an ES 2018 feature, is we can do this, specify that we want these scripts to be loaded as modules, self-contained environments, not just populating everything inside the global namespace, by including the type module attribute in the script when we load it. So in our index.html, I can say, I don't just say run the index.js script. We could say run the index.js script as a module. Run the other.js script as a module. And that will then let them be loaded as isolated scripts so we can be able to do both of them individually. So for example, I can then log out index person object, and I can log out other person object, person object. And both of those things will be able to exist simultaneously. So I've included them as both the modules. So I go back to my code and I refresh my browser, and I immediately get a whole bunch of errors. So the problem here, you'll notice, is saying is trying to access the script at a file protocol, users class, desktop, trying to figure out where it wants to try to find this file. And I'm getting this thing where it's being blocked by what's called a CORS policy. So the challenge here is that modules are loading files from the operating system, and that's actually a security risk. Is you don't want your browser to be loading up random files from an operating system or random files from some other location you don't know about, because that's a possibility that you might load a malicious file, right? A virus of some kind. You might let somebody be able to have access to your operating system that you don't want to do. So browsers have built-in security policies that keep you from being able to do that kind of work. So in order to get around this, we can't open this thing using the file protocol, right? Which is how we've been opening all of our browser files already, right? You just double click on the index.html, that opens up in the browser, and that just runs the script, which has worked okay. But in order for us to work with modules, we need to be running this from a web server. I need to have something that's explicitly saying, here is the set of files I want to make available, including these modules, and I'll allow you to access those things directly. So we need to run a local development server, a local web server for us to be able to do this work. So the easiest way to run a local web server in sort of JavaScript node land is to use a package, another program, a command line program called live server, which creates a local, simple local web server running on your machine. So the easiest way to do this, right, is you're going to go into your and you're going to open up the terminal. It's a command line application because we're working with Node here. You want to go to the folder that has the project, the file, the index.html file, the stuff you want to run. So in this case, I need to go to my desktop and then to the lecture demos, and then this is in the ES6 set, right? And in there, that's where I find my index.js and my index.html, my JS file, and in that JS file is where there was the index, right? That's the file, the place in which I'm working. From there, I can then say I want to start a web server and I want to serve all the files in this folder, not outside of it, but just inside of this folder. So we can do that by using the npx command, which will install and run live server. That's going to be the easiest way to make this work. We're going to run live server, which is live-server. And then I'm going to add in a dot at the end. The dot says I want to serve this folder. I'm not serving the index.html file because then it just serves the file. I want to serve the whole folder, including things like the JavaScript files. So if we run live server, npx live server start, then it's going to start up the server. It'll go ahead and it'll take a moment to download that package, get it up and running. It runs really quickly for me because I've installed and run this before already. And then it starts running a server. It serves the server at 127.0.0.1 at localhost, right, your local computer, port 8080 by default. It'll tell you if it has to run it somewhere else, but that's the address you can then put into your browser. It'll open up the browser automatically, and that then gives us our code. If we pull open our developer tools here, then there's there's an extra typo, character got thrown in there. Right, you'll notice that now all my code runs perfectly. Oh god, where'd my terminal go? So that's how we can get things up and running. Live server will also automatically refresh the page whenever you change anything, which can be useful. I hit refresh anyway automatically just because I don't trust it all the time. So you need to run live server in order to run anything that works with modules. If you're just running a script file on its own, no need to use live server, that's fine. Once you've got it running, you just access it and work in the browser and everything works exactly as normal. You can stop this by using the Control-C command in the command shell. That'll cancel, turns off the server. You can make sure to do that. I'll note that live server is used if you're doing like DOM level work, like we're doing sort of at the moment right now. When we get into doing things in React, React comes with its own development web server, and we will no longer use live server for that. So we're going to use live server really only for practicing with modules in this particular point. Okay, but now we're able to run our two scripts, index.js, other.js, and each one can define their own person file, person object, right? This can have a person object, and this can have a person object. I don't have to worry about namespace conflicts. I don't have to worry about variable names conflicting across each other. Cool. So great. So this is about old people. So I can create a function here. Maybe this is going to be have birthday. And I want this to be a function that takes in a person object. Sure. And this is going to have my person objects age is going to be equal to person objects age plus 1, right? So this function takes in a person object and has them grow up, and will also log out happy birthday. Well, just we need a function that does it. Cool. So of course we've written a function now inside of other. It would be kind of nice to be able to use that in index.js, right? I would like this index.js to be able to have access to that function without having us have to copy and paste it. Now, of course, I can't just now call what I name the function have birthday. I can't just call have birthday on person object from index.js because this file doesn't know about that function. It doesn't know it exists, so it can't refer to it. So when we're working with modules, we have to be able to import values from other modules. So we can import libraries and modules and other files from things and values from other modules or other libraries in our JavaScript, not inside of the HTML. This is similar to what you might have done in Java or in Python, right? In Java, you probably did import java.util.ArrayList, where this was importing a module name and then importing a variable. I don't have a version in Python in here, but in Python, it'd be like from module import library, right? From math import square root, same kind of thing. The syntax we're going to use in JavaScript is called ES module syntax. Is going to look kind of like that. It looks much similar to how it looks in Python than it does in Java. In this case, we're going to type import curly braces, and then inside the curly braces, we're going to say, what's the value I want to import, and then from, and then which module or library I want to import them from. So this was importing from java.util, import util, and the thing we're importing could be something like ArrayList. So the syntax we'd be using here, right, in my index.js, is I would be importing the haveBirthday function. That's the thing I want to import. And I'm going to import it from the other.js file. The path we use here is a relative path. So because index and other are in the same folder, I'm just going to say, go grab other.js from where they are. They're relative to each other in the JavaScript structures. So that's kind of the structure we're going to use. This is what's called a named import. I want to note this isn't the only syntax used in JavaScript for importing things. In Node, there's a function called require, which is basically the same idea of doing import. So you would say require, and then the library you want to require, and then that will give you sort of a global version that refers to the whole library, all of util, and you can then refer to ArrayList inside that. We won't use this in this course, but if you see this show up if you're looking at other libraries or other demos or other examples, just think this is doing importing work. That's what's supposed to be happening. Also be careful that when you're writing JavaScript code, you don't accidentally import or require something that you didn't actually mean to, because you might get interesting results. Okay, so we can import these files. Great. So if I go back to my code and I refresh this, you'll notice that it says it failed to sort of figure out what's going on. It failed to actually find the file in the first place, which is kind of a little odd. Oh, sorry. Our path needs to start with a /. If you don't have the /, then it doesn't know how to find that relatively. It's actually going to go look inside the node modules folder. So we always put a / in front of it in order to indicate where I'm trying to find stuff. Cool. Which then brings the error I actually thought we were going to get, which is that when we now try to load and haveBirthday, it says the requested module of the JS does not provide a haveBirthday. So the first thing we need to do in order to import something, if we want to use it elsewhere, is we need to export it. We need to make it available in the first place. So in these modules, all these variables are private. They are restricted to that module, and they are only allowed to be accessed by other modules if we explicitly say, make them accessible. It's a little bit how, like in Java, you might make something public, a little bit. So everything by default is private, and we can explicitly make them public. And the way we do that is by exporting them. So we import things from one module, so we export them from another. We got a real mercantile kind of behavior going on here. The way that we do that is we're going to add the keyword export in front of any value we want to export. So if I want to export the function haveBirthday, I would type the word export in front of haveBirthday. If I want to export this person object, I could export the person object, but export in front of the constant, right? Export goes in front of everything else. You don't need to export everything. That's considered bad practice, right? You only want to export sort of the things that are relevant for other modules, right? So start by not exporting anything and then add exports in as you go. Cool. So I can export the haveBirthday function, and then in my index.js, I can then say I want to import the thing called haveBirthday, which then makes it available as a function for me to be able to use inside of index.js. I can now say haveBirthday for my person object, and I can then console.log my person object. So we can see that that new Joel, index Joel is growing up. This could be index Joel. Right. So if I then do that, now he has an age that's not a number because they started out wrong. So let's give him an age. Oh, let's pretend that he's 18. That'll be fun, right? And now when he has a birthday, his age goes up to 19, right? Because granted, I've now, from the perspective of this file, there is a haveBirthday function I've imported, even though it's defined inside of this other module. And that's the basic. That's how we import things. These are called named imports. We are importing them by name. So again, our paths always start with a dot slash, and they are relative to the existing JavaScript file. So this, I don't have to say go to js/other.js. I'm not relative to the HTML. I'm relative to the JavaScript file. Okay. Import ES6 modules have one of the most complex set of function option, like syntax options available. So there's lots of different special ways we can import things as we go. We can use the as keyword to alias things, both at the importing and at the exporting side. So for example, I can import this function foo and give it my own special nickname. I can rename it as I import it. So maybe instead of calling this have birthday, I could import this as the grow up function. In my code then, right, now have birthday is not defined because I didn't call it have birthday. I now called it grow up so that now this person can grow up and we have the same effect, right? I can give things nicknames as I import them if I want to. It's not super common, but we will use it occasionally. Have birthday. We can also export things as we can export them with an alias. So I can say export this with a particular name. That's kind of creating like a public stage name for people to import things by. Let's see. Oh yes, other things about importing. You can import multiple values by putting them as a comma separated list inside of your curly braces. So if I want to export have birthday, let's also export a function greet, console.log hello world, right? I can export function and have birthday and greet. I would import them as have birthday and greet, right? I can import both things at once. And then of course I can call greet. So we use comma separated list to import multiple different things. So we can alias as we import. It's possible to, if there's lots of things I want to import, I can also just say import all of them at once by using that star syntax that you've seen in Java and Python. That imports all of the functions, but not locally sort of by name. Notice there's no curly braces here. It imports a single value, which we get an alias as like the module or other, or whatever we want to call it. And we would then access the individual properties, parts of it that happen to be there available as their own values. So then this would say, get me everything that's exported by module, and I could say, go to the modules foo, the modules bar. That would let me refer to, for example, others happy birthday, others greet function. This isn't super common. It's more common to import things by name to use them directly, but sometimes if there's lots of things you want to import, you can do that as well. Okay. And that's the basics. Again, we can import lots of pieces. Now, importantly, other important thing to note about importing, if you look at the ordering here, right, notice that it says, first thing that happens in my code is that it says executing other.js. That's the first line of code that happens. Then it does other.js. Then only after that does it say executing index.js. That's because my index.js, the first thing it does is imports other, which causes the other module to be executed, right? It actually runs all of that code. So if that other module has side effects, like it console logs, it declares variables, it calls functions, those will all happen even before I get to my next piece. So that can be a little bit careful if you accidentally call functions in sort of your like library modules that you aren't, that there's not side effects you're not unexpecting for that to happen. Okay. The other option that we can do, and we will do a lot with importing and exporting between modules, is we can specify what's called a default export. Every module is allowed to have one of their exports be the default. And we do that by including the keyword default after we say export. When the default represents like what's kind of the main thing you might want to be exported by a module. So for example, maybe have birthday is the main part of this module, and I want to make that the default. So the way I could do that is I would say I want to export this default function. Right? This function is being exported as the default. You only get one of them, so you pick one thing you want to be the default. One thing per module, right? Everyone can export one default. Okay. Exporting function as default. Now, back in my code here, my index, where I'm trying to import have birthday, when I rerun my code, notice that no longer can I can't import it by name anymore. Once something is exported as a default, effectively it loses its name. It's like you take away its name. Now you're not sharing it by name. Here's the have birthday thing. you're sharing it as, here's the default thing, which means that we can only import it as a default. I can't import it by name anymore because it's not being shared with a name. It's being shared kind of anonymously as the default, right? It's like that's its special title. That's all it's being shared as. We import defaults by using the syntax import some name from the location. So from the other.js. And whatever name we're going to give it, whatever we put right here, is the name we want to give to that default export. So we're going to export that default as whatever we want, right? It's being shared as the default, and then we can call it, when we import it, whatever we want. We get to alias it. Think of it a little bit like we're importing the default as greet, or we're importing the default as the default. So we can import, this is going to be called, maybe we just call it other. It's very common. You just actually name whatever you import from the name of the module itself, right? So this is, we're going to import the default other. Here, we'll call the other default. That seems pretty reasonable. So now have birthday doesn't exist anymore, but other default does exist, and other default does the exact same work. Oh, we can't import have birthday anymore. And that makes our code run again. So default imports and exports have this very particular syntax. Default imports do not use the curly braces like they do with a name. So this is a named import. This is a default import. They don't use the curly braces because you're not importing by name, you're importing it as the default. So those are distinct ways of importing things, values. In practice, always use named imports. That tends to work better, right? Just do everything by name and you'll be fine. That said, some external libraries or other modules you might want to include in your application may be using defaults to share their materials, right? That's how it's being shared. So because it's being shared as a default, you have to import it as a default. So if they're in your own work, your own things that you're sharing, you can share everything by name, but sometimes you'll want to share by default. Sometimes the other things that are being shared with you, you need to import them by default. So you need to be careful about distinguishing between this. Watch very carefully for if something says it's a default import or a named import when you want to import. Okay. So a couple of heuristics and guidelines about exporting and importing values from modules as well. In general, only export a value if you need to use it in another module. Right? When in doubt, keep everything private. Don't export things. Do not put export in front of every single variable. It's both insecure and kind of wasteful, and it causes problems. It's not necessary. Only export the things that you need to export. It's possible you might have some secret hidden functions. They're useful only by one module. Don't export them. You don't need them. In general, use named imports. It makes it easier just to keep track of everything else and sort of worry about if you want to add an additional exports later. Just use everything by name and you'll generally be fine. But watch out for those defaults because they're going to come up and trip. They're going to come around and trick you sometimes. If you have a module designed around a single value or a single function, like it does one thing only, React components are good examples of this, then you can make it a default export. Not required. Making it named works perfectly fine. Yeah. That said, just because it only exports one thing doesn't mean that should be the default. You can do it by name and it'll tend to work smoother and everything will tend to work better. Cool. So yeah, so that's the basic syntax. So again, the important parts here is that we export values from one function in order to, by using the export keyword. We import them by name using import curly brace with the name inside the curly brace to import from other modules. Make sure you're running the live server in order to be able to, the server in order to be able to actually do module-based work. You can again stop the live server by hitting Control-C, and that'll stop it. And that should let you be able to then work with modules. You'll use these a lot as we start getting into React, because React, we work with lots and lots of different modules, and we're constantly importing and exporting between them. So you're going to want to get used to being able to write the syntax and be able to work across multiple different files.